Hello, everyone. We're going to wait just a minute more to let people filter in before we begin. Okay, hello, everyone, and welcome to Smithsonian Gardens' weekly webinar series, Let's Talk Gardens. Before we begin, I just want to note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube as well as our website, and that closed captioning is available. And to enable the closed captioning, all you have to do is click the CC button on the bottom of your Zoom menu and select Show Subtitles. My name is Zach Johnson. I'm the Education and Living Collections Technician here at Smithsonian Gardens. And I'm back again this week for your host because Cindy is taking a lovely vacation. But we have a wonderful program today from one of our own at Smithsonian Gardens, Sylvia Schmeichel. I'll remind you to please use the chat box to ask any questions, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Sylvia has a wonderful talk to give, so I think we should jump right in. I'll be back on the end. So Sylvia, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Zach. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that you're having a beautiful sunshiny day like we are here, although it was pretty chilly this morning. And Cindy asked me to put together a presentation based on one of our newsletter articles that I wrote over the winter about winter garden maintenance for wildlife-friendly habitats. And I think we were all very pleasantly surprised to hear how many people had more questions and liked that topic. And so we thought that we'd dive in a little bit more to that and talk a little bit about what we do here at the gardens and how you can translate those practices into your home garden and your community. Like I mentioned before, this the notes for this have been written down in one of our previous newsletters, and Zach will be sharing that link with you later on, and it will also be attached to the email of the recording when it comes out in a week or two. So don't panic, you don't have to feverishly write notes. So we'll just dive right in. Let's get started. So many of us know that we like having wildlife in the garden. There's been an uptick in awareness of how our gardens promote biodiversity and support wildlife. And many of us love to see wildlife in our garden and utilizing it. And so we know that it's something important and it's something that we want to do, but sometimes we don't always know exactly why. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. I take care of the gardens around the National Museum of Natural History, and with our great team over there, we have a wide variety of native plants and a lot of really great wildlife that we see even in downtown Washington, D.C. And I'll be sharing some of those pictures with you, things that we've observed. So I've been working in public gardens for about 15 years at various locations, and these are some of the things that I've noticed just working with so many native plants. Basically, I'm all for people that are gardening at home. You're doing it for fun, you're doing it in your off time. You know, we all are busy and have a finite amount of time and energy. So if it can save you money, if it can save you effort and it's less work, it reduces your pests because you have beneficial insects that are keeping things in balance. And also, my favorite, permission to procrastinate. I know we all like to put things off to the last minute if we don't have to. So you're officially getting permission to procrastinate with this lecture. And also talk about learning more of the architecture of our native plants and how we can support a diversity of wildlife in our gardens. So there are three basic parts to this presentation. So while mostly we think about what we want to plant that we can support, we might not think about the way we care for our garden spaces. And so we're going to talk about thinking of who you want to attract to your garden, and what that wildlife, whoever it is, what they need, and then how you care for your garden itself to make it more inviting and sustainable for those wildlife that you hopefully will see if you haven't already gotten them into your garden. All right, so the first step is sort of thinking backwards about who do you want to invite. So what's your end goal? Here are some photos of some little critters that we found in the garden. On the left, I believe that this is actually a bee mimic. It's a little fuzzy, but we have all kinds of native pollinators, butterflies, bees, wasps, bats, all of those lovely things. We have toads. You can see here on the right, there's a picture of a toad. Now, I didn't garden specifically to invite toads. I found them in my mulch pile, but I thought, hey, why not? Let's put them under a little tree there where there's lots of nice debris. You maybe find lots of crickets and tasty things to sustain himself on. In the center picture here, this is actually a ladybug larvae. So this is the juvenile stage. And when I see those, I get excited because I know that that means that there are more to come and that they will be eating those bad bugs, so to speak, that might be feeding on my plants at an unhealthy level. So when you're thinking about gardening for wildlife, this is a question to ask yourself or your community or your family. Who do you want to visit your garden? Do you have kids at home that like to sit outside at night and you want to see bats? Do you love butterflies? Are you really into raptors and birds of prey? So think about who you want to garden for, and then choose the plants that help support the life stages of those particular wildlife species. And there's a lot that could be a whole talk in and of itself. So I'm just going to talk in broad terms today, specifically to sort of the planning and maintenance as we head into the fall and winter months. That's a great time to be planning and strategizing for next year's tasks as well. All right, so a supportive habitat is specific to each species and must consist of sufficient and suitable sources of food, shelter, protection, and space for wildlife to mate and raise young. So these are the four basic components that wildlife needs: food, water, shelter, and space. And so that means food throughout the year. It means a variety of diversity of food. It means regular water. It means clean water. So even in the winter, shelter can be anything from an actual nest to materials to build shelter, and then enough of the garden and enough of the plants that the species can mate and reproduce and expand their size in their community. So fall, here we are in fall. It's the end of October. It's almost Halloween. And that is really the best time for planting. And so as I spoke about, wildlife needs food. When we say that, we mean, of course, for gardens. So food from plants. And so that means plants that are going to provide food throughout the year, not just in the summer months. So this is a great time to be hitting your favorite garden centers and your local nurseries. And a lot of times communities will have native plant sales, or maybe you have a friend or neighbor who's dividing plants. And this is a great time to be finding those native plants that are great for wildlife and planting them. One, because towards the end of the season, it tends to be on sale, which means you can get more plants and save money. Always a great thing. You'll also be able to get the plants in and have them adapt to their new home, their new condition more readily, because the temperatures are cooler, and it tends to be, at least around in the mid-Atlantic, temperatures tend to be cooler, and we tend to get a little bit more rain. So those roots will grow nice and deep, and we'll be able to adapt so that next spring, that root system will be really healthy, and the plant will have hardened off, and you'll get hopefully a new flush of growth, and it will be even better in the spring. So another reason to use native plants, they need less from us as gardeners. So we don't have to add much fertilizer. We don't have to use a lot of chemicals. They don't need as much water, and they're already adapted to the climate that you live in. That's why they are native, because they've survived all of the climate changes and weather patterns and all the sort of minute idiosyncrasies of your specific region. And also our native plants co-evolved with their pollinators to be perfect partners. So they're already well matched, whereas some of the lovely plants that we have from other parts of the world may not be as useful to our native wildlife. Also, this is the time of year where we're doing a lot of fall turf and lawn care. So typically we're aerating, we're overseeding, we're fertilizing, maybe we're doing some major renovations depending on the condition of the turf. And so when you're doing that, I think that it's worth thinking about what's going into that turf on that lawn care. Maybe you don't want as much turf to take care of. Maybe you want to create some more garden beds next year. Maybe you want to switch to an organic fertilizer instead of a synthetic. Maybe those dandelions and clover are such a bad thing because wildlife can use it. One of the experiments that we are trying here on site is we've installed a pollinator-friendly lawn, which basically is a regular turf lawn that has a mixture of fescues that are fescue grasses that are great for our particular region. And then we've added in low growing flowering annuals that can be used for different pollinators and insects. And so we have been pretty successful in some ways. I mean, we're still learning some pros and cons of that and tweaking that maintenance regime. But I encourage you to think about your lawn not just as a green carpet, but a living space that can also support wildlife. And so I found this great, I guess, cartoon in the center there. It says, "Hear ye, hear ye. Are you still dressed like this? Then why does your yard still look like this?" Making a notation to very old world, old style, traditional turf lawns that is a whole other interesting sociological tangent. So I won't go any more into that, but stay tuned for future webinars. We might be doing that soon. Okay, so going back to our native plants in our gardens. So when I think about the garden, I think about it as a big living system. And with native plants, I often refer to native ecosystems. I go on a lot of hikes and walks in the woods, and COVID especially, we had a lot of time. A lot of us went outdoors at a higher rate than maybe we were before. So I made it a point to spend some of that time out in nature to sort of study different patterns and ecosystems, learn from Mother Nature, and then translate that into how we manage the garden. And so one of the things that I learned from Mother Nature, she doesn't vacuum. So what does that mean? Sylvia, we know that Mother Nature doesn't vacuum. What do you mean by that? Well, one of the biggest ways that we can help wildlife is to leave the leaves. This is not a new concept. There are a lot of people that have been promoting this management style, and it's a change in aesthetic and management that a lot of us are used to. I think a lot of us we're taught, oh, you want it neat and tidy and clean, and rake up all your leaves, and then everybody jumps in the leaf pile, and then you bag them up, and then they're sent off somewhere. Well, why are we doing that? You know, I had a great mentor in a plantsman named Roy Diblick, and he said, why are we removing the natural mulch, meaning the leaves, taking it away, and then buying mulch that we're then putting back onto the garden? And when he said that made a lot of sense to me. Like, yeah, those leaves are acting as a natural mulch. They're keeping the water in, they're keeping the weeds down, they're doing lots of great things. It's aesthetically pleasing, and if they're not too thick and they're not smothering your plants, they can really highlight your existing plants. You can see here, there's a photo on the left. This is our urban bird habitat, and we leave those oak leaves in place. And we don't rake them up or remove them. We just let them break down, and it really makes for a lot less effort, which is great because we have a lot of ground to take care of. But as you can see, it's a different aesthetic, but it definitely makes a big difference. So also, you know, leaving leaf litter. Here's a picture of a, I'm blanking on what this is, bloodroot out that I saw hiking one day, and I thought, oh, well, that's nice. You don't even have to add mulch to it. There's already leaves and bark and twigs that really highlight that green and white. And yeah, Mother Nature knows what she's doing. So leaving that leaf litter in place is great. It feeds plants when it decomposes. It buffers the freeze and thaw cycle. That's hard to say. In those winter months, it keeps the weeds down. And it provides nesting materials for our invertebrates. So there'll be little critters that nest at ground level or just underground in different forms, different parts of their life cycles. And also, I've seen birds nest where there's leaves used in them, squirrels use leaves. So it's really useful to think about leaving the leaves there. And an example of why it's useful is fireflies. And I just learned this recently. So fireflies, which are a type of beetle, live the majority of their lives, like 95%, and their larval form in leaf litter, under rotting logs, moist areas, things like that. And so if we're removing all of those housing materials for them, they don't have as many places to live. And a lot of people have been reporting seeing fewer fireflies every year. And that's because the leaf litter is being cleaned up. So if you want fireflies, just leave your leaves. So I get a lot of questions. Oh, but Sylvia, it's gonna smother my plants. I don't want it to, kill my lawn, or I don't want it to be a safety hazard, or my HOA wants things to be tidy. And absolutely, it's you definitely want to keep things tidy. You want to keep things safe. You want to keep your plants alive. And just because there are places that you need to clean up leaves, you can think about it, doing it in a different way. So one of our pro tips is, if you do need to remove leaves from a specific area, you can rake them onto a big tarp, drag the tarp to wherever they're not in the way. So it could be in a back corner, it can be of your yard, it can be underneath a tree canopy where you're already going to have a lot of leaf litter anyway, and that can act as a natural mulch. Or sometimes if your leaves are too thick in your lawn, or you have way too many and you're like, I don't have all day to rake leaves, you can actually take your lawnmower and mow over them and chop them into smaller pieces, and sometimes that will help if they're not too thick. All right, and here's some other examples of that aesthetic that you can still have, plants can still grow through the leaves. They're nice and dry and crunchy. even sometimes the brown can make those green evergreens pop and give it a nice woodland feel. So along with the leaves, so this time of year, your plants have stopped flowering, they've gone to seed, they were starting to lose some of their foliage, and you're just getting seed heads and stalks and a lot of brown structures. And many people cut those off at the ground and clean it up. We think, okay, it's the end of the growing season, we need to tidy up, clean it up, put our garden to bed for the winter. And I want to challenge you to think a little bit differently about leaving some of those seed heads and stalks up throughout the winter. Not only will it provide a lot of winter structure, something to look at. You can see, we've all seen those beautiful pictures of, the seed head that's covered in frost or ice or snow, to give something to look at in the winter months. But also our wildlife uses them more than we realize, especially seeds and berries. Wildlife especially birds, need things to eat throughout the winter months, and that's where they're going to get them, is your seed heads that you leave up. And let's say that, same thing with the stalks. If you're finding that it's just too ugly and it's just driving you crazy and you can't stand it, then cutting them down to the ground, but maybe leaving a pile of them in the back corner or the back of the bed. Same thing with your leaves. They can still be on your property, but if it's visually bothering you, you can sort of shift them to the side and hide them, and that will still provide some overwintering nesting sites for your wildlife. Also with these sticks and stalks, they will, a lot of insects will bore into the stalks themselves and lay eggs or basically hibernate. And so by leaving those stalks up, it provides them spaces to overwinter. And so that's something that we don't always see, but we've noticed in the spring when you see little bored holes in the stalks and stems. So I encourage you to rethink about how you take things down before the winter months. Here's just a few pictures of things that in wintertime. On the left, we have a blueberry bush. You can see that the plants are storing a lot of their food. They're starting to change colors because the chlorophyll is draining out. Up here on the top right is juniper, which is our native cedar. And you can see those nice waxy fat berries. Birds love to feast on those, but they'll also nest in the physical branches themselves of our evergreen trees. On the bottom right, we have a goldfinch who's feeding on, I believe those are echinacea seed heads. So you're thinking about the whole life cycle of your plants and how they are contributing to wildlife, supporting wildlife in some ways, and what you have available throughout the year. So we talked about leaving the stalks and stems up, and when I've read a lot about how do you know when to leave, how long to leave them up? When do you cut them down? Do you leave them up forever? So typically we do leave the majority of our stalks and stems up throughout the year, but sometimes we need to start cutting them back because things are starting to grow underneath. So what I will do is I'll actually cut the stalks in sections, 8 inches or longer, and then I'll leave that on the ground. So we'll end up having sticks about this long that I leave on the ground as a natural mulch. And then at the very base of the plant, where the crown of the plant is, I'll leave 8 inches or so until the very last minute in the spring, and before I cut it back, so that the wildlife can really utilize as much of overwintering nesting sites as possible. And that's a different aesthetic, and that's hard to retrain our brains to make acceptable. So that's one of our pro tips, is you can leave the stalks, but cut them in small sections and leave the debris on the ground rather than raking them and taking them off site. So why, here's some examples of why that's important. On the left here, we have, I believe this is an aronia, which is your beautiful fall foliage, lots of great berries for wildlife. And here we have an Eutheca, which is a praying mantis egg sac. And so they lay their eggs on these stalks and stems and then emerge in the spring. It's adorable when you see like 100 teeny tiny praying mantids walking around your plants. The top right here, you can see this is, we've all seen bird nests. That's not particularly unusual, but it's inside the stalks of a Fothergilla. And you can see there's a wide variety of materials from looks like bark to small grasses, things like that. But also you'll notice there's some plastic in here. This is very common in the nests that I see downtown. Birds will use what's in their environment. And if it's plastic, if it's, food wrappers or whatever, we're in a highly urban environment, they will utilize what they find. And so if we provide a variety of natural materials for them to use, they'll have plenty to work with. On the bottom right, this might be a little hard to see on your screen, but there is a stalk here, and then there's something very small and white where my arrow is. And those are actually lacewing eggs. And lacewings are a beneficial insect, and they lay eggs on the very end of these very long hairs. And then they emerge and eat the bad bugs that might be chewing on our plants. So help keeping the good bug, bad bug balance is how I describe it. So seeing those is like, okay, this is working. So these are signs that what we're doing is being helpful, because we're seeing evidence of wildlife utilizing what we're leaving for them. Print here, excuse me. So along with those stalks and stems and leaves, we think about, we've got this tree on our property and it's dead, we should remove it. Again, let's look at Mother Nature, what happens there. These are all photos that I've taken either around campus and I've just been going on walks, and trees just rot in place. They break down. You can see the mushroom fungi that are coming, the lichens, moss, things like that. And then the wood itself will start to break down. And if you've ever gone in, I have nieces, and so when we go walking in the woods and we pull apart what's underneath this log, you'll see all the little creepy crawly bugs and things. So you know that there are insects that are using those broken down logs. And so taking that knowledge and observation from Mother Nature, here's some more examples of trees that have been left, they're dead. This is a wetland area. This is just in the woods, but you can see there are these big cavities. And so this is what we call a snag, which is a tree or a part of a tree that can be used as a nesting site predominantly for birds, but also acts as a food source because there's a lot of bugs in here that are decomposing that wood. And they're fabulous sort of mega supporters of wildlife. And many people think, oh, it's a dead tree, it's ugly, it's not safe, get it out of here. Certainly, if it's a safety issue, consider having it drop to the ground, but maybe you leave it in place. Maybe you leave it on the ground itself, or if it's low enough to the ground, just leave it as a decomposing snag. So this is sort of one way that we've taken Mother Nature's cue and incorporated logs into our landscape. And knowing that we are a public garden and we have millions of people from all over the world and we need to keep it tidy and safe. Here are a couple examples. We have a stacked wood pile with beautiful birch that came down, and we've seen all kinds of things growing in the cracks and crevices. And I was actually out there this morning, and there are some mushrooms that are starting to grow on the side as it decomposes. So just because the tree comes down doesn't mean that it has lost its usefulness to wildlife. And so the bottom right, if you all have been downtown and seen some of our gardens, you've probably seen this. This is in the Ripley Garden. Janet Draper is a very talented artist and horticulturist there, and she designed this log wall living bug B&B display here. So you will see those in our gardens as well. Now this is really interesting, this picture here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but you know, we talked about leaving the leaves, but I think it's also important to note that it's okay to leave some space in your garden bare. It doesn't have to be 100% covered in plants, because many of our native insects are ground dwelling, or they are solitary ground nesters, and that means that they're boring into the soil and they need it to be loose and sometimes a little sandy so that they can bore down into the ground. And so leaving patches of bare ground, dry stacked rocks, brush piles, or sort of leaf litter, along with clean water sources, is a way that we can manage our gardens and our sites so that wildlife can utilize all the nooks and crannies. And so it might be a little bit blurry, but this picture is actually a wonderful surprise. We were digging up some plants to transplant, and we noticed, oh, the ground is buzzing and moving. And so we looked closer, and there was a sort of a nest of some of our native bumblebees, and they were obviously very upset that we woke them up, but you can see that they have their young in the little cavities there in the ground. And so all we did was we said, okay, that they're doing what they need to be doing. So we just left everything as is. We can dig this plant up later. Let's leave them to finish their life cycle and just shift when we're going to be working in that area. So that's just an example of some of the great things that you'll find once you start to look for wildlife in all of these unexpected places. Now this on the left here is actually an egg sac from the type of spider we see on the right, and this is called an orb weaver spider, or I grew up calling them writing spiders, as in like you sign your name, you write, because they typically have a very pronounced thick band of a white zigzag. So it almost looks like, you know, Charlotte's Web writing something in the web itself. And these are very colorful garden spiders, and we love to see them because that tells me, one, that there's enough for the adult to eat, and there's enough to sustain a population, so much so that she laid eggs for the next generation. So that's a sign that what we're doing is supporting wildlife, and so we need to keep doing those types of things. This is another cool thing that we observed. Again, there's sort of the signs and signals of success. On the left here, you see this is a branch of a redbud, which is one of our native trees. And, there's these, looks like someone took a hole punch to the edge of the redbud. And I had a visitor say, "Oh, what's happened to this? What's eating your tree? You probably have an infestation." And I said, "Actually, this is a good sign, because that means the leafcutter bee is taking cuttings off the side of the leaf and using it to roll around its eggs, and they wrap their eggs in these leaves, and then they sort of stack them one on top of each other, typically in the ground, or like in a tree cavity or something." And so you can see on the right, this is what several of the leafcutter bee sort of baby wrapped swaddled packages are, that one of my colleagues found in a nest site. So while many of us think that might be destructive, it's actually a minimal amount of damage, and shows me that wildlife is using the garden that we have for their benefit. Again, here's just some more examples of signs of success. We see different birds that come through here. So some birds will eat seeds. On the far right here, this is a woodcock. Poor thing, I almost stepped on him because he camouflaged so well into the mulch. And when I saw it was there, I said, "Okay, we're not going to work in this space today because it might be nesting, it might be feeding. We'll just work around it." And if I'm correct, I believe that they're also migratory birds. So knowing that we have birds that come in and out and aren't necessarily there all the time, but may need to be resting or mating or feeding, whatever they need to do throughout their life. And then the center here, we actually have a fair number of hawks that I've seen downtown, right on the mall. And it's always sort of amazing and startling, because you don't think about having raptors on the mall, but there's enough for them to eat. So, that's great. I mean, we're happy to see them. Also here, this was, I think, a year or two ago. So it's not uncommon that we see ducks, mallards in our gardens downtown. We're close to a lot of water. So it's not uncommon that we see them. So when we do see two, though, that is an indicator that, hey, they might be nesting somewhere, and we need to be extra aware when we're cutting things back in the spring. And so we were cutting back this one garden bed, and all of a sudden something flew up in my face, and I thought, "Oh no, what have I done?" And then I realized that the mother duck was laying on her nest of eggs. And so we immediately stopped what we were doing because we didn't want to disturb that process. We left the debris in place to help camouflage her nest there. And then we just said that this is part of the natural process. We're going to avoid that space, and they get to use that part of the garden. And people often ask me, "Well, Sylvia, when do we get to cut it back? I mean, we can't just leave everything up forever." And that's always a tricky thing to answer. And so we typically leave all of or the majority of our plants, perennials especially, those stalks and stems, up through the winter until very late winter, early spring. And every year is different, and every location is different. So I spoke with one of our entomologists, and I said, "Okay, what's a good indicator of when it's okay for me to start cutting things back?" And she said, when temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees. So if you have several days in a row in the spring that are consistently above 50 degrees, that means it's warm enough for the insects to start emerging and flying around and foraging for food. before then, they're probably still going to be hunkering down, trying to make it through the winter. So like I said, every year is different. Typically around March-ish, March, April, we start cutting back, and then it's everything starts exploding because it's starting to get warm again. So that is the rule of thumb that we go by. Again, here's some more signs of wildlife using our garden. You can see tracks in the snow. I've seen, birds looking very hungry, eating seed heads in the winter. And the center picture is an example of what I was talking about earlier, leaving those seed heads and those stalks for that architecture of your plants, and then allowing, it's really great to look out and see the snow and the ice on your seed heads themselves. So that is the end of my presentation, and I know that was a lot of information, and as we mentioned before, the newsletter article will be shared with you all, but I want to thank you all for spending your afternoon with us and for turning to Smithsonian Gardens for inspiration and education, and sharing your experiences with us. We encourage you to look at our collection of recorded Let's Talk Garden series, go to our website, and also follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and also come visit us in person. That's why we're here. So again, thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to you, Zach.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was such a great presentation. It's really interesting to know that, during winter, when many things are dormant or they seem that way, that there's really a lot more going on under the surface. And it's a very important time for especially our native insects and wildlife. So thank you for a great presentation.
You're welcome.
We had a couple questions come in. So when you were talking about the pollinator lawn, somebody wanted to know what specific plants might you use to replace a traditional lawn?
Oh, that's a great question. We do have some information about our pollinator-friendly lawn on our website. If you wanted to read a little bit more in depth, and I would say that alternatives to traditional lawns can vary widely. Anything from incorporating low-growing flowering plants into your existing turf grass to completely getting rid of turf grass and just having low growing ground cover. And that there's a lot of different options there. What we use, because our space is so heavily trafficked, we have so many people, and there is a historic preservation aesthetic that we have to adhere to, being a federal and historic site. So we use turf grass species for our region, so fescue grasses, and we added the 3 flowering species that we added were Dutch white clover, self-heal, which is a little native perennial, Prunella vulgaris, and creeping thyme. And so those have been working fairly well. Each particular site might be a little bit different, but I would encourage people to just think about different alternatives to those just plain monoculture turf. So I hope that answers your question. That could be a whole talk in and of itself, and that may be a future talk, but low growing native ground covers and flowering species are a good place to start.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you touched on that, because we had a previous Let's Talk Gardens talk talking about regenerative landscaping, and a lot of it was about replacing lawns. You can find that on our video library if you're interested in that topic. Okay, and we had another question about leaving the leaves. The question was, what about the people who might decry leaving the leaves because it'll do something like clog your drains? Is there a happy medium that those people can come to?
Because it'll clog your drain. I'm assuming that means like they might the fear is that they're washing off site and going down into, like down a hill into a storm drain, I'm assuming. Or if you have a drain, an in-ground French drain or something. Yeah, absolutely. That's something to be aware of. And, being aware of your water flow on your property is important. If that's a concern, if you think that they're going to be washing down, one of the things I would suggest is raking up the bulk of it. You can always leave a little bit, rake up the bulk of it, put it on a tarp, drag it somewhere else where it's not near a drain, or you're not going to worry about it being clogging up something. That's one option for that.
And staying on the topic of leaves, somebody asked, is it possible to leave too many leaves in a forest edge area for fear of smothering roots or emerging plants?
Yes and no, I would say. So in nature, the leaves that are falling, if you're out in the woods, the leaves that are falling are typically underneath. They're only the leaves coming from the tree or plant right in that space. So what happens in a lot of our urban settings is that we clear off the hardscapes, and so it actually ends up being thicker than it would normally be should it be dispersed across the forest floor, if that makes sense. So if it's too thick, and they certainly can be too thick and some other things, and so you have to just, it's a little hard. I do the same thing in the garden where I go out and I say, okay, this is too thick here. I'm going to rake up 50%, or I'm going to take 25% and thin it out. Because yeah, you can smother some things. It just depends on what your underplanting is as well, and what type of leaves you have. If it's some nice crunchy oak leaves versus really thick magnolia leaves that never decompose and never go away and just pile and pile and pile. Absolutely. It's worth evaluating how thick they are and what the specific garden bed or ground is. But as far as a tree itself, you don't want there to be a lot of, just like how we don't want there to be the big mulch volcano on a tree, where it goes above the root flare. You don't want there to be a lot of organic material, leaves, mulch, whatever it is, near that trunk flare. So it can be thick on the soil itself, as long as it's not up against the tree, holding in moisture and bacteria and things, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay, we had a couple people mention that their lawns are particularly shady, and they were wondering what sort of native plants or native fescues might help, their lawn to look nice.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So not all shade is created equal, and it's worth considering that if you have so much shade that grass isn't growing, then maybe growing grass in that space isn't the best option. Maybe there's some other options. To that, I think I did a lecture on shade gardening on our Let's Talk Garden series, and I did touch a little bit about understory plantings and shades. There are some lawn seed mixes that are more shade tolerant, and they will be marketed that way, like Shade Master or Shade this or whatever. And it typically just has different varieties that can tolerate less sun and a little bit cooler temperatures. But maybe grass isn't what you really want there. Maybe you could consider doing some underplantings of things like ground, there's a whole list that comes to mind, like our native Pachysandra procumbens. You could do Pachara aria. You could do I've actually seen nice stands of Virginia creeper underneath trees. And you don't necessarily have to have, leaving some bare ground is okay, as we talked about with ground nesting insects and things. So, maybe it's a little bit of bare area that doesn't have anything growing.
Okay, great. We had two similar questions here. People are wondering what is a good way to provide water in your garden for birds and for toads. Should maybe they be using an electric water heater for the winter months? And also, what water sources are there at the Natural History Museum?
Okay, sure. So there are a lot of different directions you can go with this. We have, if you're the Smithsonian Gardens and you have the budget for it, you can have custom-made stone water collecting bird baths, so to speak. If not, you can use rocks or boulders that are in the, just placed out that have depressions in them that will collect a little bit of water. You don't always need, huge volumes of water. Sometimes you just need a little bit. Insects need very shallow water. You could have any type of dish that will collect, we see a lot of these bird baths and things, and that's certainly an option too. And you could have a heater to help it break the ice in the winter. I think it's also, if you have a water dish out, remember to be filling it even in the winter months. And if it does freeze over, maybe go out and take some warm water. Also, wildlife will get water and liquid from berries. So it's not, and from flesh, if there's anything fleshy for them to eat. So it's not just straight water. It can also be water from what they're eating.
That's great. Somebody asked, are there any hazards to wildlife and soil of using electric leaf blowers?
Are there any, say that again?
Are there any hazards to wildlife or the soil when you're using an electric leaf blower, around your plants?
Electric leaf blower. I mean, there's always a small percentage of damage that could potentially happen. If you don't move anything, obviously if you don't touch or move anything, there's going to be no mechanical damage. If you're concerned that you're going to be interrupting something with an electric leaf blower, maybe use it less often, or only use it during the time of year when it's you've already seen the insects emerge. Or I'm trying to figure out exactly what the question is. If using an electric leaf blower is detrimental.
Maybe they're just thinking about maybe harming the young of some nesting insect or bird or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, if you're using a low power and you're paying attention that to your area, then I'd say there's a low possibility. And if you're concerned about it, then using something that's not powered at all, maybe it needs to be a rake, or maybe you just don't tidy up that area. I mean, we use electric leaf blowers to keep the sidewalks clear because wet leaves are slippery. So I guess it's something you just have to determine the costs and benefits to using them, and maybe use them less often if you're concerned about it.
That's right, yeah, and maybe only on areas where people are going to walk, so that you reduce that chance of slipping.
Yeah.
We had somebody ask, late season, I usually deadhead some plants like asters and irises to preserve energy for next season's growth and blooms. So is it okay to only just cut back the tops?
So asters, I'm assuming that means summer blooming asters as opposed to fall. We leave up our fall blooming asters. You can certainly deadhead the tops, but those stalks are really helpful for insects to use. And so you can, the native asters, I don't worry too much about them losing energy for next year. Things that are bulbs and corms and things like irises, that is a practice that some people use. I would deadhead. So if I had, like the Dutch iris that are pretty common, after they're done flowering, I would cut the flower stalk down, but I would leave the foliage. And irises that are not native, I'm not sure what wildlife uses it other than the physical, they could live under the leaves, but I would not cut the irises, the foliage back unless I was going to subdivide them, lift them up and subdivide them.
Got it. Okay, and whenever we have a Smithsonian horticulturist on here, I always love to know, concerning your topic of winter, what are some of your favorite winter blooming plants that you might be putting in the garden this season?
Ooh, some of our favorite winter. So we recently just renovated one of our entrances, where we have a lot of evergreens and conifers. And so I got to research different native evergreens that are coming in unusual forms and cultivars. And so there have been some white pines that are in a cascading form, like Niagara Falls and things like that. And that's been really fun to see different prostrate versions or dwarf versions or cascading versions of our native plants that are starting to come on the market. I love a Fothergilla. What else have we got? Cephalanthus, which is buttonbush, is a great plant that we're planting right now. Some of our aronia, I found a dwarf version of our aronia, which has beautiful burgundy foliage in the fall. Yeah, and actually I've been really intrigued with using a Virginia creeper as an ornamental. I think a lot of us just grew up seeing it everywhere and like growing up trees and hanging on trees and don't think much of it, but we've got a really nice stand of it that's growing up a crabapple tree at Natural History, and it's just like bright red right now. So that's been really interesting to see what you can how you can train it to grow on things. And sassafras, that's another great one.
That's great. I love the idea of using something that most people don't think of as ornamental as an ornamental plant. We have about 1 minute. Really quickly, are there any insects or birds or anything that you specifically garden for? So you'll plant something to attract.
Not specifically. I mean, one of the main focuses of the Gardens of Natural History. So we have an urban bird habitat. I take care of the stretch that's considered the pollinator garden, although the entire garden is supports pollinators. We have seen really a decrease in monarch butterflies. We monitor them every year and plant plants for them and leave milkweed up for them, and their numbers across the country have been declining, and we've noticed that here as well. And so I think that's one of the things that we're aware of and concerned for. So I want to see more butterflies especially monarchs. So it's a tough gig out there on the National Mall for wildlife sometimes. So
It is, but when people like you are there in the gardens, it makes their lives so much easier.
well, yeah,
And
we try.
we thank you for that. Sylvia, thank you so much for this great presentation today. I
You're welcome.
want to let everybody know this has been recorded. We'll put it on YouTube after we get the closed captioning sorted out. And also, if you haven't already, please consider taking our audience survey. It'll really help us out in developing more great programs for everybody. So Sylvia, thank you again. Thank you to everyone in the chat. Thank you to all the participants, and we'll see you out in the garden. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for joining us.